So we have like one final talk in this session, and for this talk we have like Dr. David Erritzoe from he's a clinical head of like the Psychedelic Research Center at Imperial College, and he's going to tell us more about like psychedelic therapy and like the pitfalls, the dangers, the good things. Yeah, David, thank you for coming here. He's also like trained in Denmark, which was great to find out that Copenhagen was once his home. And so it's like a home game for you. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks a lot. Yeah, so, and thanks for the invite. As you can hear, I'm not really from the sort of community of longevity as such, but more from sort of psychiatry, neuroscience, and psychedelics in particular, more and more over the last years. So I will be presenting work done in our center, and actually it's the first center of its kind in the world at a large university, specifically focusing on psychedelic research. So the center has existed for a handful of years, but it was built on more than 10 years before that on a lot of quite targeted research in humans into psychedelics. And we have been part of sort of this reopening of this psychedelic field that some of you might have heard a bit about, that it's happening more and more. So now we're not the only center, there are centers everywhere studying psychedelics, which is great. So first, for the people who are not super familiar, what compounds we are talking about. So the classic serotonergic psychedelics, those are the ones we typically talk about when we talk about psychedelics. And that's mainly sort of LSD, psilocybin, magic mushrooms, DMT, which is the psychedelic active compound in ayahuasca, and then also mescaline. So, and sometimes people also talk about 5-MeO DMT as one of the classics. Then you have some more atypical that have different pharmacology. They work in a different way, but there are some downstream effects that are overlapping with the classic psychedelics, and also in the phenomenology, so the psychological experience overlap with the psychedelics. So MDMA sits between stimulants and psychedelics. You have ketamine and also PCP, angel dust, and for that matter, ibogaine, which is a very different pharmacology. They sometimes are described a bit as dissociative psychedelics, which might not be perfect, because what seems to really differ them between classics are more like in disembodied feeling. But again, the pharmacology is different. What is happening that is deeply exciting is the classic psychedelics are coming, they are being developed, and I'll show some of the data. Ketamine already exists, it comes from medicine. It has been repurposed by Janssen, studied for treatment-resistant depression, and now has a license for intervention in depression. MDMA is the next in line to come, so before the classics will come. MDMA is finished phase 3, so final clinical trial phase for PTSD, and is soon going to be filed to the FDA for licensing, hopefully. And then next in line will be psilocybin and DMT. And also there's LSD work happening, not very much mescaline. One of the reasons is actually the duration of effect time that are listed here. It kind of gives it a bit away. It's not super practical to do therapy sessions with mescaline and LSD because they last forever. They are very, very long, and people need to stay overnight, and the therapists need to be at work for 14 hours. So it's a bit more convenient with the psilocybin for 5-hour sessions, ayahuasca for 5-hour sessions, DMT, pure in intravenous or evaporated form is like 20-30 minutes. So they are more practical, and they are more in focus than the others. In terms of their pharmacology, these classics are quite close in structure to serotonin itself, one of the key neurotransmitters in the brain. And that also explains some of the pharmacology. If we zoom in to a serotonergic synapse, they actually mimic to some degree the effects of serotonin itself. They are agonists, they stimulate, they have some of the same effects as serotonin on some of the same targets. There are 14 different serotonergic targets in the brain, and in particular one that is called the 2A receptor is a key target for psychedelics. So the classic psychedelics, they stimulate that receptor, and the more they stimulate it, the more potent they are as a psychedelic. If we selectively knock out or block out that receptor, we take away the psychedelic effect. We even take away the mood-improving effect of psychedelics. We can also see that the more they bind to it, the more intensity the effects are. Other drugs, SSRIs, conventional pharmacotherapy for depression and other mental health, basically almost everything that's not psychosis is being treated with SSRIs. They work on the presynaptic side, they affect the production side, the reuptake part of things, whereas the psychedelics don't really touch that. They work more postsynaptically directly on the serotonergic receptors. In terms of the name, it's a beautiful name, and we do not tend to use the term hallucinogens because that is just a fraction of what they're doing and not actually that interesting for their potential in mental health. But psychedelic means mind or soul revealing or manifesting. It's a term coined by a British psychiatrist, Humphrey, in the 50s, I think. And that is a pretty good description of what they're doing. In terms of their safety, which is, of course, very important and was very important before we reintroduced them in modern clinical testing at Imperial, and also Johns Hopkins did work in parallel, mainly these two centers who did the work more than a decade ago. And so they are non-addictive, they are physiologically very safe, they have a huge window of safety in terms of toxicity and doses you can give. So a good therapeutic index. In terms of on the negative side, that's mainly related to psychologically challenging experiences, that you need the safety, the support, the preparation psychologically and the support around it, and also integrative psychological work afterwards, in particular when it has been quite tricky, a bumpy ride in the experience. They also produced transient nausea and headaches. And then there's a bit of an Achilles heel, which is can some people experience false or even hidden memory? What is what? How do you land it? That's why it requires very, very experienced and quite responsible therapeutic work to work with these compounds, and why people need to be trained up in this phase before they hit real life, clinical everyday life. So here again, bit of what they're doing. This is a mix of the blue ones are the classic psychedelics, LSD, psilocybin. Then you have in this green weird color MDMA, and then ketamine, and they overlap. They are very perceptual. The classic psychedelics, which you see up in that part of the diagram, and down in the end you have the psychological peak or mystical type experiences, which in an old scale called altered state of consciousness scale was termed the oceanic boundlessness, which is a term that we don't use that much because conventional colleagues in psychiatry, they're like, what is oceanic boundlessness? Anyway, we call it psychological peak or mystical type experiences, and they have to do with a profound sense of insightfulness, meaningfulness, blissfulness, spiritual experience, and so on. And you can see that what I mentioned about ketamine, the orange one, peaking towards disembodiment, which is a different in effects from the other ones. In terms of safety, also if you rank them, David Nutt published that. He's the head of our center and my mentor, so to speak. He published that in 2010 in The Lancet together with a group of experts, and it has been replicated several times since, that sort of the ranking of harms of different compounds, drugs that people are using, from heroin to ketamine, GHB, cocaine, tobacco, alcohol. Alcohol comes out up here as the most harmful overall total score, and mushroom down in the opposite end, which obviously gave us comfort to test these compounds again in modern time. What happened was that the first era in the 50s, 60s, there was a lot of work done, 40,000 people, patients being treated with psilocybin, LSD in particular. A lot of it was alcohol addiction. It was wearing off. Vietnam War, Nixon, war on drugs. It was banned around 1970 with UN conventions, so then it died out, but now this is happening, and it's going even more crazy now over the last years. And on clinicaltrials.gov, you'll see there hundreds of trials in different indications, namely in mental health, with a range of different psychedelics, both novel and classics, and also some neurological conditions as well. One of the key focuses also for us, and what we did the first depression trial in the modern era with any psychedelic, we used psilocybin. And one of the reasons that a lot of the focus has been on depression, first of all, is that the old data were pretty good for depression. That's a good reason. Another is that some monster gap in the field. Nothing much has happened in development of antidepressants since the 80s, where you had the first SSRI, Fontex or fluoxetine. Then you have had modifications over the same recipes ever since. You have 40% who don't respond at all. They're treatment resistant per definition to SSRIs and antidepressants. And you can also see 1 out of 8 who recover from an episode of depression, only 1 in 8 will remain depression-free. So there's a big need for development of new treatments. And because it's such a costly, such an expanding condition that has such a negative impact of that many people, that has been the main focus of the classic psychedelic development so far. But not only, and you'll see a bit more. So we did the first trial, as I mentioned, and also the second one. I mean, there might have been one in the middle that other people did. But the first one, that was an open-label pilot trial, 20 patients with severe depression, 2 of them moderate, 18 of them severe. And what you see, this is the depression score, and this is the bold bar, the average of the 20. Of course, there are variation between these participants. This is up to 6 months. The primary outcome was after 1 week, and you see a dramatic drop in depression severity. And that really elicited an insane amount of optimism and interest in this space, and made some companies start jumping on board with it. We then did a better, larger trial where we thought, okay, now we want to compare it to conventional pharmacotherapy, so an SSRI, one that performs well. Danish, now I am Danish, although I work at Imperial in London. A Lundbeck compound, escitalopram, Cipralex, 6 weeks daily treatment versus 2 sessions with 3 weeks between, with a full dose psilocybin, which is proper altered state of consciousness level psilocybin. And then people in the psilocybin arm, they received daily placebo instead of the escitalopram, and over here they received psilocybin session with a placebo level psilocybin, but with the same psychological preparation, same music, same dim light, same rooms. And some of the setting that we use, this is a novel setting we have in London at another hospital, so we have set this up. It looked a little bit, and we find it very fancy, it looked a bit less fancy in those trials. So we have in a way taken over a former electroconvulsive therapy, ECT clinic, and converted it into a psychedelic testing lab in London. So the context, the setting is important for the undertaking of these sessions, of these trials. So it's not just the drug, it's the drug plus the setting, the physical setting, the music, and the therapist presence, and the preparation and guiding support and integration after. So it's a mix of all that we are testing. That's why it's complicated to test it against anything, but we do it as well as we can. And when we did it as well as we can, with this sort of relatively smart design where we had the conditions appearing in both arms, apart from the presence of the psychedelic, we can see that, and the SSRI in the other arm, we can see that overall, these are 4 different measures of depression. The green on the left side of the dotted line means it favors the psilocybin condition, and you can see the far most outcomes, including 3 out of the 4 depression measures in these patients with depression. It favored psilocybin in this trial. We could also see the remission and response rates were much higher in the psilocybin arm than compared to the escitalopram arm. And also, we saw a lot of other things that I might not have time to go deeply into. Some of them is we followed them up for 6 months, which is not out yet, and we saw sustained effects actually in both arms. Some people might say it's all expectancy, it's all placebo. If they want it to be better, it becomes better. But we didn't actually see expectancy effects for the effects of psilocybin. We saw that for SSRI, for escitalopram, surprisingly. Then very, very interesting additional things that is really where it separates these treatments. One thing is that you might obtain an antidepressant effect, but here we saw reduced rumination, reduced thought suppression, which is really interesting feature, and maybe even more interesting is that avoidance, which is a classic in a lot of mental health, turned into acceptance, and also a sense of disconnect turns into a sense of profound connectedness. And even speaking about climate change, people become significantly more nature-related when we measure that as well in these trials. Also, instead of putting a lid on, so you know that you can experience blunting, so emotional blunting with SSRI, that's one of the side effects for some people. With psilocybin, what we see more is that the lid being taken off. We see an increased ability to feel emotion, even increased ability to cry, which we don't see in the SSRI arm of a trial like this, enhanced sexual function rather than reduced, and and this I won't go into, this is very pharma geeky, but important, and it's not fully characterized, uncovered anyway. So it's not just depression. Here the focus is a bit on depression. Also recent pilot work in depressive phase of bipolar type 2 also looks safe and good in bipolar type 2, so not with proper manic phases. But we also have trials, and we are running trials in OCD, we are running trials in chronic pain, we are running trials in anorexia nervosa, we just finished, and setting up trials in gambling disorder and opioid addiction in our lab in London. But and a range of trials have been done. Alcohol addiction, smoking cessation, really strong results so far in the US. You can see overall in a lot of trials, suicidality goes down, which speaks directly to longevity, at least, yeah. Larger trial by one of the leading companies in the field of psychedelics, Compass Pathways, they showed very similar results, so good effects of the proper psychedelic dose, 25 milligrams psilocybin, performed better than the other doses, and sustained effect over 3 months in their data set. And when you look at effect sizes compared to other treatments, talking therapies, SSRIs, when you look at all the different trials so far, you can see that the effect sizes, so the measured statistical effects are larger than what is seen so far. This is an early phase, and that will probably diminish over time. You have a lot of optimism and enthusiasm early on, and obviously a really important thing, you can't proper placebo control these trials, which is something that the regulatory bodies of FDA, EMA, MHRA, they are aware of, and they are acknowledging, and they are supporting, and they're even not even encouraging and supporting the development and the testing phase. They have accelerated it and prioritized it because this is one of the things in mental health that actually look like it has proper potential. I won't go into details. This is just to say, so far I've showed you data from psilocybin. That's a 4-5 hour long experience after oral ingestion of psilocybin. You have this altered state in this nice setting with music, with a therapist, but it's still 4-5 hours, so it's quite an expensive model. You have 2 guides, at least you need 1 in the room. So what about if you can have a shorter, more powerful, short psychedelic experience? So DMT, the compound from ayahuasca, if we give that intravenously, it's a 20-minute experience. So we wanted to test together with a company whether called Small Pharma, London-based company, whether that also has antidepressant effect, and maybe even to the same degree. So we tested intravenous DMT infusions. So in order not to give a really overwhelming bolus where you shoot an old psychedelic naive lady directly into hyperspace meeting entities, we did a sort of a little bit of slow infusion over 5 minutes, and then another infusion. So over 10 minutes we infused the drug, and when we did that, people were randomized to that or placebo. After we did dose escalation finding in healthies in the phase 1, we did this phase 2A trial, and what we saw was that this is the depression score measured with MADRS, which is a sort of gold standard clinical trial measure, clinician rated measure of depression, and you see the drop in the group that got the DMT compared to the placebo, and then there was a crossover, so not a crossover, but everybody were offered another dose. So the people who already got one got another one. The people who had got placebo, they got DMT. And then you can see then the placebo group who then get the DMT, then they drop down. So pretty strong data that are quite similar to what has been shown with psilocybin, which is quite exciting because then suddenly you have something that might be even more appealing as a model, also cost-benefit wise. So I'll skip these details. This, I won't go into detail, I'll just tell you that one thing that is very interesting about psychedelics, this therapy model, it's a different paradigm from what we're used to. We're used to dosing people with the same thing for a long time in mental health. Some people respond, some people don't, some people get side effects, so on. Here we have single standing intervention, 1, 2, maybe 3 sessions with time between, with a powerful sort of psychological setup. And we induce an altered state of consciousness, an expanded state of awake consciousness with these drugs. And what we can see is that when we measure the profoundness, the nature of these experiences, we can see that they relate to the clinical outcome. That's completely different from anything we are used to in mental health, right? So there's something about the experiential part of the treatment model. And we can see that across most trials, that in this case, more mystical or the more you have an emotional breakthrough in the experience, the better are the treatment outcomes. So that really speaks to a different paradigm. Not only do you have sustained effect of single interventions, you also have this relationship between the nature of the experience and the outcomes. So that together is a very different model from what we're used to. And then to bring it a little bit into your community with longevity, at least it's an attempt. Some of the mechanistic thoughts and investigations in the psychedelic field is that they are inducing neuroplasticity. That's very preclinical, and we are trying now to apply whatever methods we have in brain imaging, which is also the field I come from. We bring the methods we have to assess plasticity with PET, MRI, and EEG, including MMN and also visual long-term potentiation paradigms with EEG into the space, and apply that across trials in order to try and find out whether we can actually measure plasticity in the brain with psychedelics. Anti-inflammatory effects, again, a little bit interesting for people who are crazy about longevity. And then some of these psychological measures that I mentioned, we even see personality trait, typically understood in big 5 traits. They are pushed by psychedelic interventions, both in healthy and in patients. We see increases in trait openness, so openness to other people's ideas and values. Even people become a little bit more lefty politically, which is a hot potato I won't talk about. And more nature-related, a little bit less on neuroticism, sometimes a bit more on agreeableness. Quite interesting, slight personality changes, which is, again, where we talk about quantum change, that a profound, like a PTSD, single negative, deeply traumatic, psychological negative impact can push you quantum-wise in a negative health direction. This profound, meaningful, insightful experiences seem to be able to do the opposite. I think I will skip a bit some of the brain stuff because otherwise it'll be a bit too heavy and too long. That's in a way the main focus of what we're doing, basically, is measuring stuff with these different modalities of imaging in the brain, and we are focusing on brain complexity measures acute and plasticity measures long-term, and also changes in functional connectivity in the brain using MRI. And one of the things we have seen, which is very interesting, is that we can see that the more connected the brain gets, not just during the experience, but even a day after, even 3 weeks after, the more the global functional connectivity increases with psychedelics, the better is the antidepressant response. And when we look at that with SSRIs, which is what we currently prescribe in mental health, there's no change after SSRIs in this measure and no relationship between treatment. So potentially pointing towards it could be a different mechanism that have to do with this global connectivity measure. And again, I spoke about the lid on. We can see that when people are exposed to emotional phases and we measure their amygdala response, the sort of emotional responsive region, we can see that the SSRI, they dampen it, the psychedelics don't. So you have that sort of lid on, lid off difference in how they seem to work, and still both through different routes inducing antidepressant response. So I will leave it here and take questions if we have time for that. Thank you.
Well, the hands go up, and to be frank, I was very excited about that because I really try to bring people bring people from the psychedelics field to longevity and the other way around, and I think that was like a successful initiation of that. So, Andrea, go ahead.
Thank you for such an informative presentation. I was wondering, so do you ever feel any resistance from industries making antidepressants or anti-anxiety medicine?
At some point we were like, oh, we need to delete our Facebook and change name, and because Lundbeck will come and shoot us, but because in a way, it is a challenge to their model, isn't it? But I don't. Actually, they are inviting us in. They are curious. They are visiting some of the psychedelics companies. They are asking us now, the academic experts, what we think they should do, and I think they are basically at the moment, which is quite interesting. The big pharma, they are still not in the psychedelic game, but they are definitely observing it very closely. And I think it's meaningful that they are maybe observing it so far, because it's a square brick that needs to go through a round hole. a combination of talking therapy, which this has as well, with pharma, is not something FDA or any other regulatory bodies are set up to regulate and approve. For that reason, there's that massive thing, that obstacle that needs to be passed. And also, is it too expensive? You know, so those things in combined makes big pharma. I think they are supportive. They are curious. They are scientists. The people working these companies, they want the greater good. It might challenge their business model a bit, but they can just buy the whole thing. I mean, the psychedelic companies are tiny compared to the big pharma company. They can just buy them, but they don't so far. But they probably will in the second, let's say, MDMA passes through the FDA. Then I think they will step in and buy some of the companies. We'll see. I'm guessing. I'm so not a businessman. This is just my sense I have. Yeah.
Just we know that big pharma is still not in longevity, so let's see soon. My question is about the interesting combination of last two speakers. The question: have you any studies comparing effect of psychedelic drugs and meditation in its mechanisms? We can conclude that some mechanisms of one-point meditation or for any other meditation types sometimes looks like psychedelic effects. Have you any studies compare this?
No, so we haven't studied meditation. So we have a whole fraction of our lab that actually is studying consciousness. And if people ask me what is consciousness, I would be like, yeah, I'm not sure either. And there will be people in my lab who are much better. They come from psychology and philosophy, and we are using imaging to try with these really, really altering states of consciousness drug to push and try to understand better. But we haven't studied specifically meditation, but they have at Johns Hopkins. So they actually came from those ideas. That was Roland Griffith, this professor there. That was part of what he really wanted to do early on. And they have been studying religious expert practitioners and with meditation. There are some few overlaps in brain signal between deep meditation and psychedelic effects. So there are some overlaps. There are also some differences, but we haven't ourselves directly studied it at Imperial.
Very interesting talk. So we have a patient on ketamine at the moment, observed some of these effects. Two variables I'd like to ask you about is one, location and setting, because we've seen, this is of course N of 1, that first ketamine treatment went amazingly well, followed Mindbloom's protocol. We're having the patient go through Mindbloom's protocol. Second was a slight deviation from the protocol, and he had a terrible bad trip. So the first variable I want to ask you if you've studied is the effect of setting, and second is effect of spiritual mindset and walking in with a certain attitude about it, because our patient also walked in with a very pro-psychedelic, very spiritual attitude, and I think that helped him early on, but maybe hurt him in the second ketamine.
Interesting. I mean, we in our lab and everybody else in the field, we are all curious and really desperately trying to find predictors, find things that we can associate with how people, both how they actually are having it in the experience and also longer-term effects on well-being or on mental health symptoms if it's a patient population. So both these things, we are looking at things that can predict a baseline personality parameters, even complexity in the brain with EEG, and whatever else, abilities to psychologically surrender. There are several different components that seem to have some kind of predictive effects. And then the million-dollar question, what about the setting? The issue is that in Copenhagen, that you're in right now, had actually really problematic history in the first era. In the 60s, they had another hospital, no, we're not in a hospital, but Frederiksberg Hospital, they did experiments where they didn't consent people well. They didn't really consent people. They gave them extreme high doses, and they gave them a lot of them. They left them alone in a very, like this basement, but with nothing in it, on their own. There were some proper horrible cases, and they actually even did it against current guidelines back then in the 60s. There was a scandal 20 years later where people seek compensation and so on. So if you take so everybody is fearful of taking the setting away. because if you strip down the room, leave them on their own, no guides, then you might cause damage. So nobody is very tempted in doing that. What we'll be doing also now in Copenhagen, they're going to experiment with and without music, and with different kinds of music, and maybe interact with some of the physical setting. So it will be over the next years done more and more, but at this point the focus is getting those trials through that shows efficacy and safety in a model that is cheap enough to actually get through. And then I think it will be studied much more. What kind of talking therapy fits what compound, for what indication, for what specific patient, how do you predict what is best for who? All that will come in parallel and even after they have come through the first hurdle. So the setting question is incredibly difficult. Robin Card-Harris, who started our center with me and David Knott, he's now professor at UCSF, so in San Francisco. They are going to focus a bit on some specific things related to setting over in San Francisco, but it's difficult to study.
I just wanted to comment about, and you didn't speak to this, but I'm sure you know about bad trips don't necessarily mean bad outcomes.
Absolutely, and actually that's why we invented that scale that I had on one of the slides called emotional breakthrough. Because if you take a snap, so remember people might have a 5-hour experience. If you just take a single measure of how challenging was that, or how mystical was it, or how that might not, you might actually need some temporal zooming in and resolution, because it might be that people found it, they were full of tears, they met the monster, it was deeply frightening. But if they have that sort of emotional breakthrough, then it's going to be really, really therapeutic. Whereas if you're stuck and trapped towards the end and coming out of it in an unresolved, without a breakthrough, then it's probably more likely that it's not going to have the same benefit. So you're absolutely right. The people that find it really challenging, they almost always have this breakthrough, and therefore, although it might be that 80% of the time they were crying and struggling to some degree, it ends up being profoundly therapeutic. So yeah, and that's also, we do not use the term bad trips, because that is more used outside of the medical setting. And whereas if it's in a controlled medical setting where we prepare, we have the psychologist, therapist in there, we talk about challenging aspects of the experience. Yeah.
Thank you for an interesting talk. I wonder, what is the effects of the studies comparing psychedelics to ECT? Are there any? Yeah. There actually also are some neurobiological overlaps, and some of the connectivity that we see pre and post is overlapping with ECT. In terms of effect sizes, I mean, you know, as most psychiatrists always speak up ECT and say, if we were deeply depressed, we would take ECT because it actually works quite well. So it is quite efficient. I don't have any numbers in my head directly comparing the two. Probably not too dissimilar. Yeah, I need to look into it.
Thank you for an exciting talk right here. I was just wondering, are you considering, in addition to depression, looking at accompanying patients with cancer who are going through treatment and that sort of intervention?
Yeah, it's a good question. And actually, I didn't mention it at all. But so when we set up the first in modern era depression trial with a psychedelic in London, they had already at Johns Hopkins and NYU together, started at Johns Hopkins, they had done end-of-life terminally ill people, so mainly people with cancer. And that was what they were going to proper scale up and develop. The issue is that, and this is really irritating sometimes, you have, but that is not an indication. It's not a diagnosis to be terminally ill, to have end-of-life distress, whereas depression, major depression, that's recognized, established, and therefore you can get funding, and therefore it can fit through the system. So it was actually, in a way, a slightly system failure that they derailed it away from end-of-life distress and terminal illness towards depression because of the system, in a way. So as I see it, and I think Roland Griffith, other people at Johns Hopkins in particular, probably the most beautiful and maybe most meaningful indications of everything that you can do with a psychedelic treatment model is exactly that. And it really worked well in their early trials. It worked amazingly well. But it has not been scaled up because of these things.
Fantastic. Thank you very much, David. Thank you for your questions.